Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have restarted their Sumy offensive operations, continuing the offensive operations in the western and eastern outskirts of their Sumy incursion. They also managed to kick out the remaining Ukrainian forces within the Kursk region out of the Tetkino, leaving just a small portion along the border area remaining under Ukrainian control of Russian territory in its entirety. The Russians also managed to advance west of the Severis River line in the eastern flank of Pokrovsk as well as in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians in turn managed to make a counterattack along the border area between the Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk region, where they're working on preventing additional crossings by the Russians into the Dnipropetrovsk region. However, the Russians have entered into the Dnipropetrovsk region from two additional angles today. The total Russian advances add up to 32 square kilometers, while the Ukrainian counterattack adds up to 5 square kilometers for a net gain of 27 square kilometers in favor of the Russians. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians have restarted offensive operations within the Sumy region, counter-attacking in the western outskirts, preventing the Ukrainians from capturing the town, making a significant push within Unakivka, almost gaining full control over the town as the main logistical hub for a future Russian offensive operation further deeper into the Sumy region, and an additional crossing from Gornel in the southeast towards the town, gaining additional footholds within it and cutting it off from the riverline. The Russians managed to kick out the Ukrainians from Tetkino in the Kursk region and cross into the Sumy region from additional access. The Russians completely managed to kick out the Ukrainians from the town of Tetkino and back into the Sumy region. However, they have yet to enter into the Sumy region in the direction of Oryshivka or along the railway that connects two logistical hubs of the Ukrainians in this area. They continued offensive operations across the border into the Sumy region in the direction of Sqkm, where they managed to capture the town of Biselivka, but are now expanding along the forest patches towards the next settlements. There are two railways that enter into the Sumy region from the Kursk region here along the border, the Wolfina direction in the east and the Tetkino direction in the west. Both of them lead to the settlements here in the south, just along the border, where the Russians or the Ukrainians, whoever controlled this specific area that I've marked out, would be able to use the area as a logistical hub for a large grouping of forces. With this, the final Ukrainian push into Russian territory has been defeated. There is this small section of the border where the Ukrainians have a presence across the same river. However, due to the geographical difficulties, it is unlikely that the Russians will work to recapture these positions. Therefore, the Ukrainian foothold within Russian territory can be considered over, as there's no military significant presence within Russian territory of the Ukrainians. The Russians continued advances in the direction of Kindrativka, despite the report yesterday that the Ukrainians managed to gain full control over the town after a Russian withdrawal. The report was then pulled back for a different report stating that the Russian troops that were sent to resupply and reinforce their forces did not help a withdrawal, but instead strengthened the flanks and re-entered the town. And with this, the garrison of the town did not withdraw but stood to fight, and reinforcements have arrived to secure the flanks and are now counterattacking the Ukrainian forces to regain full control over Kindrativka. The Ukrainian presence in the western parts of the town has been significantly weakened. However, their foothold in the northern part is still strong. This is to cut off the northern supply route of the Russian forces, isolating Kindrativka from the border area in Kashentinivka as well as Novokashentinivka. However, this also shows that the Ukrainians are unlikely to gain full control over Kindrativka, and the Russians may restart offensive operation in the direction of Andrivka as well, especially with the additional offensive operations by the Russians in the direction of Unakivka. Here, the Russians have managed to gain control over the central and southern parts of the town, pushing the Ukrainians to the southern and southwestern outskirts of it. The Russians are advancing on both banks of the Luknaya River line, where they're pushing the Ukrainians out to the outskirts of the town. The Ukrainians do not have any significant supply line into the town any longer, And with the Russian push towards the southern parts, the Ukrainian foothold within Yunikivka is on the verge of collapse as Russians are pushing them out of the town, for which they will have no cover for several kilometers. This means the Russians will likely gain full control over Yunikivka within a few days, and the Ukrainian forces would have no withdrawal point. This means they will likely take large casualties of what remains of the garrison during these coming days of Russian offensive operations gain control over the area. Getting control over Yunikivka will establish it as a logistical hub for Russian forces within the Sumy region, and the Russians can restart storming the next defensive line of the Ukrainians from Khotin in the west to Mariin in the east. At the same time, the Russians continued offensive operations in the eastern parts, where they recently gained a foothold in the northern outskirts of Myropilya. They followed up with an additional assault to the western parts of the town, isolating the crossing across the Sel River between Myropilya and Sapsilia. With this, the Russians have gained an additional foothold within the town on the western parts of it, as well as the northern part of it, and have managed to cut off one of the two supply lines of the Ukrainians in the area. The Russians would like to push through along the main road to cut off the southern connection as well, gain control over Myropilya, which will act as a secondary logistical hub for Russian forces within the Sumy region for additional offensive operations across the border area between the Kursk and Sumy regions. The largest obstacle the Russians are facing within the Sumy region is the lack of supply lines. The main supply line going through Sucha, but the Ukrainians had strong defenses in the direction of Yunikivka. With control over Yunikivka, the Russians can build up their offensive operations in the Luknia direction, and with control over Myropilya, the Russians can significantly expand offensive operations within the Sumy region on a much wider front, almost doubling the size of the front line. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians continued offensive operations as well. Across the Serbs River line, the Russians managed to make a small advance in the northern flank of Novomikhailivka as they continue in the northern direction towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the main road connecting the Russian positions on the western bank of the Serbs River line in the northern and southern flanks. The Russians made additional advances in the eastern flank of Pokrovsk as they continue storming the defensive lines of the Ukrainians on the eastern flank of the city. They also managed to re-enter Popiv Yard further to the east. The Russians have regained a foothold within the town and are pushing the Ukrainians to the northern outskirts, where they're looking to regain control over the town and push the Ukrainians out of it to gain full control over Poltavka, as well as push into the direction of Rusin Yar. And with the recent push in the northern direction near Novotoretsk, the Russians would likely look to gain control over the main road leading towards Volodymyrivka and expand offensive operations along the eastern defensive line of the Ukrainians near Pokrovsk. Breaking out the defensive line, the Russians gained a foothold within the town of Boykivka, gaining control over several fortified positions of the Ukrainians between Boykivka and Razina, as well as expanding a foothold within Fedorivka. The Russians are here continuously storming the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. Their main objective is to flank the city of Pokrovsk, cutting off the northern and northeastern supply routes into the city, operationally encircling the city on its western supply routes. They're also looking to gain full control over the defensive line in the eastern flank from Virulyubivka in the south all the way up to Sqkm in the north to gain control over a strong flank on the eastern parts of the city for the operational encirclement of it, but also as a bridgehead for the offensive operations to cut off the main supply line of the Ukrainians north of the city and develop offensive operations further north beyond that of Pokrovsk and to the rear of the defensive lines on the western flank of the city. To the southwest, the Ukrainians counterattacked near Moravka, gaining control over the road to the south of the town, while the Russians continued their foothold on the eastern parts of the town. The Ukrainians have the fortified positions in the outclass position here to the west of Moravka, which is an old and well-fortified position. The Ukrainians with this have a strong position here in the border area, especially with the close proximity to Novopavlivka, which acts as a logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces in the area. And with the lack of frontline positions for the Ukrainians to resupply, a lot of these supplies are being redirected to Moravka to hold the positions there. The objective of the Russians here is to gain an additional bridgehead towards Novopavlivka across the border area, and the Ukrainian objective is to prevent that, and they're doing so by launching counterattacks locally to kick the Russians back from the border area. The Russians in turn continue offensive operations on the southern flank near Horhove, where they're looking to cut off the Ukrainian remaining positions on the northern flank of these settlements by connecting with the forces in the Dashny directions with the forces on the eastern flank, creating additional crossing across the Dnipropetrovsk and the Donetsk border area, where they are looking to gain control over the supply lines, operationally encircling the forces of the Ukrainians, and almost physically encircling their forces. This will straighten out the front line south of the anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth located south of Novopavlivka, and this will allow the Russians to prepare for a push in the direction of the town from the southern and southeastern flanks, and redirect their forces to the east in the direction of Moravka, where large clashes will take place before the Russians are able to cross over the border area towards Novopavlivka from 3 separate directions. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians made numerous advances here as well. And to the northeast of Tolstoy, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Novokhatsk, as well as Roshivsk, where they managed to gain control over both settlements and the eastern flank of Tolstoy. The Russians also made a push in the direction of Zeleny, gaining a foothold within the southern outskirts of the town, gaining control over the forest lines between Novokhatsk, Tolstoy, and Zeleny. Russians are here strengthening defensive operations on the northern parts of the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, gaining control over the river line, the Lefty River line, leading along the border area and the settlements along the main highway, and to the north, gain control over these positions by storming their weak points and isolating them from the remaining supply lines of the Ukrainians in the area. To the southwest of Minna, the Russians gained control over the remaining parts of the town and expanded beyond the town in the western direction of Oleksandrohat. The Russians are slowly flanking the remaining settlements and fortified positions of the Ukrainians here in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Russians also managed to gain control over the defensive line of the Ukrainians to the south of Voskresenka along the border area and crossed into the Dnipropetrovsk border in the direction of Malivka, getting a foothold within the town. The control over the fortified positions and the foothold within the town allows for an additional push by the Russian forces into the Ukrainian side of the border. At the same time, the Russians have gained control over the last defensive line ahead of the fortified positions just outside of the town. With control over these positions, the Russians are fighting over the southern outskirts of the town and flanking it from the north, cutting off the supply lines and attacking it from the weak spot. The Russians continued offensive operations all across the Donetsk region and the majority of the front line. With the restart of the offensive operations in the Sumy region, the pressure on the Ukrainian positions increases. It is likely that the Russians will slowly step up offensive operations in the coming weeks as they continue the summer offensive operations. As for the main summer offensive that I have been predicting, additional sources are starting to build up on that notion, where Bild, the German newspaper, speaks of a Russian mega offensive that will take place in the coming weeks in the later half of the summer, where they speak of 30,000 North Korean soldiers that are supposed to take part in it as well. This could mean the Russians would significantly step up offensive operations in the coming weeks as they continue putting extreme pressure on the Ukrainian positions. The operational encirclement of Pokrovsk and Kościuszynivka are right and around the corner, with Russian forces flanking both cities from the weak points and reaching the final defensive lines of both cities. The Ukrainian forces are within a very difficult position. If both of these cities are operationally encircled and the Russians launch a large-scale offensive at the same time, the Ukrainians would be in a very, very difficult position, which will significantly weaken their defensive positions within the Donetsk region and in generally the annexed territories that the Russians have put claim on in the south and east of Ukraine. At the same time, with additional pushes along the border area, the Russians may look to significantly improve the logistical situation of their forces and geographical advantages in some of the sectors of the front line where the Ukrainians have advantageous positions, especially around the Kharkiv region, eastern parts of it in the direction of Izium, as well as in the southern section in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and in the northern direction in the Sumy region, where the Ukrainians do not have that strong defensive positions, yet the logistical and geographical advantages that can be attained through offensive operations in these directions are significantly higher than busting through defensive lines that have been prepared for years. More on that in a different video. That is going to be all for this one. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.